July 1944. The hedgerow country south of Omaha Beach, where the fields are small and the banked earth walls between them are older than the nation, now fighting across them. A German squad leader lies in the corner of one of those fields, behind a hedge thick enough to hide a man and a machine gun. He has real experience, the kind that teaches a soldier what an enemy will do a half-second before he does it. He has been told what the Americans are, and what he saw of them in Tunisia the year before seemed to confirm it. They have machines and shells without end. What they lack, the assessment went, are soldiers who can think for themselves once the shooting starts. Take away the officer, and the body goes still. So he watches an American squad cross the field, and he looks for the officer. The man leading is not hard to find, half-crouched, pointing, the one the others glance toward before they move. The German fires, and the man goes down into the wheat and does not get up. By everything this soldier has been taught, the attack should now lose its shape. The squad should flatten and wait for someone with rank. That is the window. That is when a defender kills the rest of them at his leisure. Those men, and the German squad leaders trying to read them, are nearly all gone now. What is left is the record, and an account most people have never heard told straight. If it is pulling you in, take a second to hit like and subscribe, and leave a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from. It means a great deal to know who is listening. The window does not open. The fire does not slacken. A man who, 1 second earlier, was only another rifleman in the line comes up out of the crops, and the squad reforms around him without a pause. 2 men up and moving, 2 men firing to cover them. Then a switch, then forward again. There is no shouted conference. There is no hesitation that a watching marksman can use. And when that second man falls, the same thing happens once more. A third takes it up, and the rhythm holds. The German cannot find the head of this animal. He is trying to kill the one man whose death ends the attack, and the attack does not appear to contain such a man. That night, or the night after, he writes it down, the way other German soldiers that summer wrote down the strange wall of fire from American rifles and the artillery that fell on empty fields. The Americans, he reports, do not stop when their leaders are hit. We aim for the man in command, and the unit keeps coming as though it never had one. To understand why that German could not explain what he was seeing, you have to begin with a fact that turns the whole story strange. The doctrine the Americans were using that morning, the idea that a soldier should keep fighting and keep deciding when no officer is left to give orders, was not an American invention. It was a German one, and the Germans were proud of it. The Prussian and then the German army had spent the better part of a century building a way of command that the rest of the world found difficult to copy. Its name was Auftragstactik, which translates, roughly and incompletely, as mission command. The principle was old, and it was deliberate. A commander told his subordinate what result he wanted and why it mattered, and then left the how to the man on the spot. A junior officer who saw an opening was not merely permitted to take it. He was expected to. An officer who waited for permission while the chance slipped away had failed, even if he had followed every order to the letter. The Germans traced this back through their wars of unification, through the campaigns of the 1860s and the war against France in 1870, to the elder Moltke and the staff system he built. They had carried it through the First World War and into the Second, and it was a real part of why a German division so often reacted faster than the army facing it. Between 1864 and 1945, in war after war, that habit of trusting the lowest competent leader had paid for itself. It demanded a particular kind of trust, running in both directions. The senior officer had to accept that a subordinate might do something he had not foreseen, and might be right to do it. The junior officer had to be willing to answer for a decision no one had ordered him to make. That trust was not written into a manual, so much as bred into an officer corps over generations. And it was the part that outsiders found hardest to copy, because it was less a technique than a way of raising soldiers. So the German in that hedgerow held, without quite thinking about it, a particular idea of himself and his enemy. He belonged to the army that owned initiative. Flexibility at the lowest level was the German trademark, the thing that separated a real soldier from a conscript who could only do what he was told. And the Americans, in this picture, were the conscripts. They were the rich amateurs, the men whose country could build 10,000 trucks, but could not, the assessment held, build the one thing that mattered when a plan fell apart, which was a soldier who would act on his own. There was evidence for that view, and it deserves to be stated plainly. In February of 1943, at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, American troops met experienced German forces for the first time and came apart. Units advanced into prepared, killing grounds without proper reconnaissance. Coordination broke down between the infantry and the armor and the guns. Green units froze, or moved when they should have held, or held when they should have moved. Officers who had never seen combat gave orders that made sense on a map and got men killed on the ground. The result was a defeat that confirmed, in German eyes, everything they already believed. A phrase made the rounds of the senior levels of the German command that captured the working assumption with contempt. The Americans, some German officers said, were Britain's Italians, junior partners who would crumble the moment the fighting turned hard. One German soldier, writing of the American infantrymen before the great battles of late 1944, judged him as not worth much at all. That assessment was not stupid. It was built on real observation. The problem was that it had stopped being true, and the men holding it did not yet know, because the change that had come over the American army between Kasserine and Normandy was not a change anyone could photograph. No new tank announced it. No secret weapon. What had changed was underneath all of that, in the way the army learned, replaced its losses, and pushed the right to decide downward into the ranks until it reached the man in the wheat who picked up an attack his sergeant had just died leading. The change began, as real institutional change often does, with a refusal to lie about a failure. After Kasserine, the American army did something the German army, by 1943, was finding harder and harder to do. It treated the defeat as information. Commanders who had failed were relieved and replaced by men who had studied why they failed. The tactical manuals were rewritten at exactly the level where the disaster had happened, the platoon and the squad, where individual men live or die by what they do in the first seconds of contact. And the lessons were pushed out through the chain of command with a bluntness that German officers, interrogated after the war, described as astonishing in an enemy. The vehicle for this was a series of bulletins the first United States Army issued and reissued, compiling after-action reports from units that had just been in contact and stripping out the practical lessons. Not philosophy. Specific, granular instruction in what had worked and what had gotten men killed. One lesson appeared in those pages again and again, across different units and different battles, because it had been paid for so many times in blood. When you come under fire and you cannot find the enemy, do not go to ground and wait. Move. Fire at the likely position and keep moving. A stationary man is a dead man. The right response to being shot at is aggressive forward movement by soldiers who do not need to be told, one by one, to make it. What strikes you, reading those bulletins now, is how little they flatter anyone. A unit's mistake was printed for the whole army to study, the names taken out, but the error left plain, so that a rifleman in a division that had not yet seen the enemy could learn from the death of a man he would never meet. That instruction was aimed at the rifleman, not only the officer, and that is the heart of the matter. An army that teaches the private to keep moving when the plan dies has already begun to teach him to lead. The historian Michael Doubler, whose study of how American infantry actually fought in Europe remains one of the most careful accounts we have, argues that the Army's great strength was not the quality of any single weapon, but its ability to learn quickly from its own mistakes, to adapt when a plan met an obstacle, and to find answers at every level of the ranks. Doubler describes a force whose innovations came up from below as readily as they came down from above, out of a culture he calls democratic and entrepreneurial, in which a sergeant or a private who found a better way to crack a hedgerow or clear a village could expect that better way to spread through the whole army. A force built like that does not collapse when its officers fall, because its competence was never stored only in its officers. It is the difference between an army that keeps its skill inside a few trained heads and an army that has written that skill into every man it sends forward, so that losing any one of them costs the unit a soldier, but not its ability to fight. There was a precedent buried in the American record that should have warned the Germans, if they had read it. In the First World War, the same tendency had already shown itself in the citations of men who took command when everyone above them was gone. A corporal named Alex took over his platoon at a critical moment, when all of its officers had become casualties, and led it forward against a machine gun. A corporal named Manning did the same thing near the Ork River when his platoon commander, and his platoon sergeant both went down within minutes of the attack beginning. These were not yet doctrine. They were instinct, the reflex of a citizen army whose men were not in the habit of waiting to be told. What happened between the wars, and especially after Kasserine, was that the American army took that instinct and built a system around it, so that what had been the act of an unusually bold corporal became the ordinary expectation of every man in the squad. Nowhere was the system tested more brutally, or more purely, than in the dark hours of June 6, 1944, above the Normandy beaches. The American airborne divisions jumped in the night, and the drop went wrong almost everywhere. Aircraft scattered by cloud and anti-aircraft fire put men down miles from where they were meant to be, mixed across the dark Norman countryside in ones and twos and small handfuls. Officers came down with none of their men. Privates came down among strangers from regiments they had never served in. By any reading of the German model, this should have produced paralysis, a mass of leaderless soldiers crouched in the hedgerows waiting for an order that no surviving structure could give them. It produced the opposite. Men gathered around whoever was there, and whoever showed the will to lead, regardless of unit, regardless sometimes of rank. A captain might find himself leading a mixed band drawn from 3 regiments and 2 divisions, not one of whom he had met that morning, toward a bridge he had studied for weeks. A sergeant might find himself the senior man in a fight for a crossroads, with no officer within miles, and simply take charge of it. Composite groups formed in the dark, took on objectives that belonged on paper to other units entirely, cut roads, ambushed columns, and spread so much confusion that German commanders badly overestimated how many paratroopers had come down. German units that night reported being hit from several directions at once, and assumed they faced a far larger force than had actually landed, when in truth they faced small bands that had organized themselves out of chaos in the dark. The United States Army's own account of those hours is plain about the cause. The beach assault objectives were eventually accomplished. It records, because of the initiative of the resourceful soldiers and leaders scattered through the ranks. The chain of command had been shattered, and the Army kept fighting anyway, because the fighting had never depended on the chain being whole. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe and turn on notifications, because there is far more in the record still to cover. Your support is what keeps these accounts coming. The clearest single picture of what this looked like from a German side comes from a low ridge in the Ardennes on the first morning of the last great German offensive in the West. December 16, 1944. Near the Belgian village of Lanzerath, 18 men of the Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon of the 394th Infantry Regiment, 99th Infantry Division, held a line of dug-in positions at the edge of a wood, with 4 forward artillery observers attached to them. They were good soldiers, chosen for their marksmanship and their fitness. Several of them had come out of the Army Specialized Training Program, bright young men pulled from college classrooms when the Army decided it needed riflemen more than it needed engineers. Their officer, First Lieutenant Lyle Bauch, was 20 years old, one of the youngest officers in the Army. None of them knew that they were sitting directly in the path of the spearhead of an entire German army. What came at them through the morning was a battalion of German paratroopers, roughly 500 men of the 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, part of the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division. These were not second-rate troops. The paratrooper arm had been built for volunteers, and it carried real prestige, and these were among the men the German command trusted to lead an attack. They ran into a wall. The Americans let the lead elements come on, and then opened fire from concealed, prepared positions on the high ground, and the German assault broke against them. A second attack came and broke as well, and then a third, each one starting from the same low ground and climbing the open approach into prepared fire, and each ending the same way, with the paratroopers driven back down the slope and the line of the Trielines still held. The American radio had been jammed by German martial music broadcast across the channel, and the artillery they called for never came, because their position lay just outside their own division's boundary, and the guns were committed elsewhere. When Bauch radioed back for instructions, asking whether to hold or to pull back onto a stronger line, the answer that reached him was to hold at all costs, and his men dug in deeper and waited. 18 riflemen and a handful of observers, with no fire support and a jammed radio, held a battalion of elite infantry on a key road for most of a daylight that, in December, is not long, and they made the Germans pay a price far out of proportion to their numbers. When it was over, German losses around that ridge ran to about 92 killed and wounded. The Americans lost 1 man killed, a forward observer, and perhaps 14 wounded, before the position was finally flanked at dusk and the survivors were taken. The detail that matters most for this story is what the Germans did when the firing stopped. They did not push straight on. They paused, because they were convinced that the volume and the stubbornness of the fire they had met could only have come from a far larger force, that the woods behind the ridge must be packed with American infantry and tanks. The German paratroopers had been held up for the better part of a day, and then made cautious by a platoon they outnumbered by something close to 20 or 25 to 1. They could not read the strength of what faced them, because the thing facing them was producing far more than its numbers said it should, and was producing it with a cohesion that did not flag when men went down. Lieutenant Bauck himself, captured and badly used in the days that followed, believed for years that he had failed, that losing his platoon's position meant he had let the army down. It took decades for the full weight of what those men had done to be understood, for the delay they had imposed on the German spearhead to be measured against the wider battle, and for the recognition to catch up. The platoon would become, man for man, the most decorated American unit of its size in the entire war, and most of those decorations arrived long after the fact, when the survivors were middle-aged men with families. So the puzzle stands in full. An army the Germans had written off as leader-dependent amateurs had become an army whose small units would not break when their leaders fell, and that fought with such force that veteran German troops could not believe how few men they were facing. The answer is not courage alone. Every army in that war had brave men, and the German army had more than its share. The answer lies in 3 things the Americans had built, and 1 thing the Germans had lost. The first was training that deliberately spread competence downward. The American army did not treat the squad's knowledge as the private property of its leader. Men were cross-trained, so that the rifleman could run the automatic weapon, the automatic rifleman could lead the fire team, and the senior private knew the sergeant's job well enough to step into it without being walked through it. The expectation, written into how the army prepared its men, was that every soldier should be ready to take over the role of the man above him the instant that man went down. A squad that lost its leader did not stop to ask who was now in charge. The men already knew. The order of succession was understood the way a family understands who carries the name, and it ran down past the last stripe to the most reliable private, so that there was always someone whose turn it was to decide. A unit built that way does not lose its function when it loses its commander. It promotes itself, in the field, in seconds, with no order given. That is precisely what the German in the Hedgerow watched and could not put a name to. The second was the equipment, which had pushed combat power and the power to decide down into the smallest units. Every American rifleman carried a semi-automatic M1 Garand, which gave a squad the volume of fire of a much larger force armed with bolt-action rifles, and that alone is part of why 18 men at Lanzerath could sound and fight like a company. Each squad had its Browning automatic rifle for a base of fire, and behind all of it sat a radio and a fire direction system that let a junior leader, sometimes a sergeant with no officer anywhere near him, call down the weight of several artillery battalions onto a single map reference in a matter of minutes. A German squad in trouble had to send word back up a slow chain and hope. An American squad in trouble could reach back and pull the whole arm of the army down on top of its problem, with no officer present to approve it. It inverted the very thing the Germans thought they understood about the Americans. The dependence on firepower, which the German assessment had read as a crutch for soldiers who could not fight on their own, turned out to be the thing that freed the lowest leader to act, because he carried the firepower with him and could bring more of it down the moment he judged he needed it. The squad had become close to a self-contained fighting force, and a self-contained force does not need its head intact to keep working. The third was the kind of men and the country that sent them. The American Army of 1944 was a citizen army, drawn from a society full of people accustomed to solving problems without asking permission. Its ranks were thick with foremen and farmers and mechanics, men who had spent their working lives making their own decisions and fixing whatever was broken in front of them. Drop men like that into a fight and take away their officer, and a good number of them will look around, work out what needs doing, and begin doing it. The German assessment had mistaken this informality for weakness. It read the American lack of rigid hierarchy on the battlefield as a lack of discipline, when it was a different and, in that war, far more survivable kind of discipline, one that lived inside the individual soldier and not only in the structure above him. And then there was the thing the Germans had lost, which is the bitter center of the whole account. The army that had invented mission command, that had taught the world the value of initiative at the lowest level, was by 1944 being strangled from the top. Hitler increasingly demanded that ground be held to the last man regardless of the situation, that no commander pull back without permission from far to the rear, that the judgment of the man on the spot count for nothing against a line drawn on a map in a distant headquarters. By the time of Normandy, German commanders were spending their energy arguing for leave to move reserves that the situation plainly demanded be moved, and losing those arguments to a headquarters that treated any withdrawal as a kind of betrayal. Whole divisions were pinned in place by orders from men who could not see the ground. The German tradition of trusting the junior leader was real, and in the conduct of the actual fighting it often survived, in the skill of the platoon commander or the stubbornness of a machine gun crew. But at the level of decision that shaped whole campaigns, the doctrine had been hollowed out by a high command that no longer trusted anyone. The Germans were losing the very thing they had taught, in the same months that the Americans were discovering it. The man in the hedgerow belonged to an army that prized initiative and was being forbidden to use it, and he was watching that initiative come at him out of the wheat, in the hands of soldiers his doctrine insisted could not possess it. When German commanders sat down after the war, in captivity, and tried to explain to their American interrogators how the campaign in the West had really gone, the contempt of 1943 was gone from their accounts. The senior officers who wrote the long series of manuscripts the United States Army commissioned, men who had led corps and armies against the Western Allies, came back again and again to the same admission. The American soldier they had dismissed had turned out to learn faster, adapt more readily, and improvise more freely at the small unit level than their assessments had ever allowed for. Gunther Blumentritt, who had served as chief of staff of the headquarters that ran the German defense of France, was among those who acknowledged that American infantry had reached a level of flexibility the German army had underestimated. Fritz Bayerlein, who had watched his Panzer-Lehr division torn apart in Normandy, and Friedrich von Mellenthin, whose memoirs would become required reading for the post-war armies that studied the Germans, left records that point the same way. It was a hard thing for professional soldiers to write, that the enemy they had been most confident about had turned out to be the one they understood least. The thing the Germans could not explain in the field, they could at least name in hindsight. They had been beaten, in part, by an enemy whose strength did not sit where their doctrine had taught them to look for it. The ground itself still carries the marks of this. Near Lanzerath, a memorial now stands where 18 men held a ridge against a battalion, a quiet place that most travelers pass without knowing what happened there on the first morning of the Bulge. The bulletins that taught American riflemen to keep moving and to keep deciding survive in the archives, the after-action reports of men who paid for each lesson in advance, and the idea those documents carried, that competence and the right to decide should reach all the way down to the soldier actually in contact, did not die with the war. The mission command doctrine taught now, in American and Allied staff colleges, as a deliberate philosophy, with its own manuals, traces a direct line back to what the Army learned in those hedgerows and forests. The lesson the Germans wrote first, the Americans in the end lived more fully. Go back, at the last, to the German squad leader in the Normandy field, hunting for the one man whose death would end the attack, and never finding him. He was not a fool, and he was not facing fools. He was facing the answer to a problem he had been taught only his own army knew how to solve. There was no single head to cut from that American squad, because the command had been distributed through every man in it. Kill the leader, and another was already leading. Kill that one, and the rhythm did not break. The Americans fought without officers because, in the way that counted most, every one of them had been turned into one. Thank you for staying with this until the end. The men who fought this way mostly came home, said little, and became fathers and grandfathers who rarely mentioned it. The stories belong in the record. If what you heard here stayed with you, the film's waiting on your screen, carry it forward. Subscribe if you have not already, and I will see you in the next one.